Okay, so this is adolescent development. This is the rest of chapter 8 on families. So we're going to talk here about how mothers and fathers interact with their adolescents. So mothers tend to be a little more involved with their adolescents in terms of the day-to-day. So making sure that, for example, you get to school, making sure that, they know your whereabouts and things like that. But we do find that there is a gender difference here where fathers in particular tend to spend more time being involved in parenting when they have sons. So they tend to kind of be a little bit more involved with their sons and kind of let mom handle more of it when they have daughters. So a little bit of a gender difference there in terms of how moms and dads interact with their adolescents. When we talk about parenting, you've probably heard this term before, co-parenting. So co-parenting means, co means two, right? So both parents are on the same page, right? Both parents are working together to parent the child in a certain way. So this sounds great, right? Yes, but a lot more difficult in practice than it is to talk about as a theoretical kind of idea here. So co-parenting can be undermined by several different things. So we can talk about poor coordination, meaning that the parents don't really have good communication. They aren't talking with one another about what their expectations are. One parent undermining the other parent. So for example, this might happen when one parent maybe talks badly about the other parent, or how about this one? Your mom says, no, you can't go do something. And so you go ask your dad and your dad says yes. Okay, so that's undermining, right? That's not a good thing in terms of parenting. I remember doing that once, and my mom, she got so upset. I never did it again. She was so angry with me for doing that. Disparagement of the other parent. So this would be like saying bad things about that other parent, like, oh, well, your mom's always like this. You can never count on her for anything. That's just how she is. Oh, okay, so that is damaging to the co-parenting relationship. When there's a lack of cooperation between the parents, so that one probably makes sense. And then when one of the parents is maybe very kind of disconnected from the entire process. So they're not really involved, perhaps negligent, and in extreme cases, this can be situations that actually put the adolescent at risk. So think, for example, if one of the parents or someone who's supposed to be taking care of the adolescent is a heavy drug user, well, that will likely result in negligent parenting that will also then place the adolescent at increased risk. So not a good thing. All right, so let's talk about conflict. Okay, so adolescents in terms of conflict with their parents. So we've already established that they tend to fight with mom the most often, and that most of that parent-child conflict is about autonomy granting, so freedoms that the child wants, but the parents maybe don't think you're ready for it. And a lot of it happens in early adolescence. There is, however, when we look at the conflict between parents and their adolescents, this idea that there's a generation gap. So there's like this gulf between what parents value and what adolescents want to do. But the reality is that the research just doesn't really support that. That if we survey adolescents and if we survey parents, their beliefs actually tend to be pretty similar. So they both tend to believe that hard work leads to positive outcomes. They both tend to value things like particular achievements. They both tend to talk about aspirations or things that they want to achieve within a career, right, or within a work setting. And believe it or not, adolescents and their parents oftentimes have relatively similar views about religion and also politics. There are, of course, exceptions, but parents, the family, exert a very, very strong influence on those particular aspects of development. So religion, we already talked about, but political beliefs also, that political beliefs, adolescents, kind of their first source of information about that is connected to the parents. And so if your family is very conservative, then you are also likely to be conservative as well. All right, so in early adolescence then, parents and children are conflicting quite often. They're arguing about those everyday life kinds of things, and in particular, the kinds of everyday life things that involve some degree of freedom. So think about the very, very boring, mundane kinds of arguments that maybe you had with your mom in adolescence. Maybe it was something as simple as, I want to wear this to school, and your mom says no. Okay, well, that's about freedom, right? I'm an adult, I think. I want to be able to choose my clothes, and your mom is saying, no, you are not old enough to be wearing that to school. So that's an example of that parent-adolescent conflict. All right, let's talk autonomy and attachment. Okay, so big things going on here as adolescents are attempting to become more autonomous. So meaning as they are attempting to become more independent, more separate from the parents. Big thing here in terms of establishing autonomy, a specific type of autonomy that we call emotional autonomy. So emotional autonomy. So being able to relinquish or let go of that childlike dependence on, I need my parents for everything. As you move into adolescence, we hope that you can start maybe taking on some of those responsibilities yourself. So think, for example, if your parents ever had you do things like maybe call to make your own doctor's appointment. That would be an example, right, of something that you used to rely on your parents for, but as you're getting older, your parents think, hey, maybe you can handle this now, right? Or maybe like to pack your own lunch to go to school, checking to make sure that you have your own homework done. So you take care of that. It's no longer your parents' responsibility. So that's a really, really big one if we are looking at predictors of optimal development down the line. We do see that there are some gender differences in autonomy granting in adolescence, particularly that boys are oftentimes granted much more freedom compared to girls. And this is likely a function of our patriarchal system, where we see a need to control female sexuality, to keep girls pure, right? And so we need to protect them, right? They're weak, they're delicate little flowers. And so we must protect them. So girls are typically not afforded the same freedoms that their brothers are. So think about that in your own families. I know we've talked about that extensively. One of the big things that we see also here in adolescence is tying it back to that early attachment relationship. So remember that attachment is all about that emotional bond or that emotional connection between child and caregiver. So when there is a secure attachment relationship between the parents and caregiver, then this is a good predictor of adolescent capacities in terms of they're typically better at interacting with their peers, and they're also better at regulating or controlling their own emotions. So adolescents who can control their emotions are likely to also be securely attached to their parents. All right, so let's talk then about some more information here about attachment. So we have two contrasting models here. So an old model, the way that we kind of used to think about attachment and adolescence, and then the new model, so our new understanding of the role of attachment in adolescence. So in the old model, we used to propose that for adolescents, the goal is to essentially kind of cut off your relation to your parents and become an adult, right? So you essentially kind of detach yourself from your parents and you move into the world, right? And you never look back. And the level of conflict between parents and their children is high the entire time. This is that period of storm and stress. Remember, we talked about that with G. Stanley Hall way, way back in the first chapter of this class. So that is how we used to think about adolescence as a period of development. We now know that perhaps that's not really very accurate. Our new model is much more flexible. So instead of cutting yourself off completely from your parents and going out into the world alone and you never look back, that's probably not what happens. And you can think about your own lives and your own experience as college students. you probably look back, right? You probably rely on your parents for something, right? Whether it's just someone to talk to, someone to get advice from, you talk to them about things, right? So you still have a connection to them. So in this new model, we think of parents then as important attachment figures. So the child continues to have a relationship with their parents throughout adolescence. And the conflict between parents and their children is not quite as extreme as we might think it is. So in this new model then, we're using the parent as an attachment figure, using the parent as a secure base to go out and explore the world, right? To go out and try new things with them periodically to see how we are doing. All right, let's talk about emerging adults. Okay, so emerging adults, remember this is about 18 to 25 years of age. So for emerging adults, oftentimes they have pretty good relationships with their parents. So if you don't have a good relationship with your parents now, it will probably improve as you move into especially your early and mid 20s. Emerging adults typically state that their relationship actually gets better with their parents when they leave, right? When they get out of the home environment. So they typically share more with them. And I mean, I can tell you just from my own personal experience, I talk to my mom more now probably than I did when I actually lived in her house when I was in my teenage years. You know, when I was a teenager, I could not stand being around my mom. And now, you know, I like talking to my mom. I can hang out with her, right? And I, you know, can talk to her about things that I never would have talked to her about 20 years ago as a teenager. So one of the things, though, that is interesting about our kind of current economic context is that we have many emerging adults who maybe they leave home for a little while, but because of economic reasons, so they either can't find a job, the job that they have doesn't pay very much, they have a lot of student loan debt, they are actually going back to live with their parents. And so there are pluses and minuses to doing this, right? So one of the most common complaints from both emerging adults and their parents when the emerging adults come back home is a loss of privacy. So both the parents and the adults are saying, I really enjoyed kind of having my own space and now I don't have that anymore. All right, so let's talk about how the family is changing in society, okay? So looking at this chart down here, which is the percentage of single parent families with children under the age of 18. So you can here in the United States, we have of industrialized nations that are represented here, the highest percentage worldwide of essentially of single parent families. So we have a lot of adolescents who are growing up with maybe just one parent and also a lot of varied parent structures. So thinking about the family as that kind of traditional two-parent mom and dad, right, heterosexual couple is not the reality for many of our adolescents. So let's talk about these different family dynamics. All right, so one of the ways that adolescents and children grow up in single parent families, is a result of divorce, right? And so this is probably not overly surprising to you. So if you look at this chart right here, you will see that the type of family, if we're looking at the percentage of children who show emotional or behavior problems who are living in these different types of families, we see that in both emerging adulthood and in children, if you grow up in a divorced family, you are more likely to show behavior problems. However, these percentages, if you look at them, are relatively low. So 20%, about 25% compared to 10% who grow up in an intact or never divorced family. So that means then that although behavior problems are more likely, they are not inevitable and they do not happen even in the majority of divorced families, okay? So even though the divorce rate in the United States has increased dramatically, especially over the last 50 or so years, We are still having most children who are in a family where there is divorce. Most of them do not have significant adjustment problems. Most of them do just fine. All right, so let's talk then about one consideration that you may often hear about as couples are perhaps considering if they should get divorced or not. And so one of the things that couples will typically talk about or weigh in terms of their decision is, should we stay together for the sake of the children, right? Would it be better for us to stay together? And so the research on this is interesting, right? In the sense that sometimes it is better for parents to stay together for optimal adolescent and child development, but not all the time. Okay, so here are the caveats. So if you are in a couple where you fight all the time, and the fighting it's a high level of conflict, it's very acrimonious, so meaning it's mean, you are constantly at each other's throats. If getting divorced, if getting separated stops the conflict, that is actually better for your children compared to if you stay together and you keep fighting all of the time. However, if you are in a relationship where you don't really love each other, but you don't really fight either, then it's probably better to stay together for the sake of your children. So the level of conflict seems to be the mediator here in terms of answering this question, should you stay together for the sake of the children or not? So if it reduces the conflict, it's good that you separate. But if there's no conflict to begin with, then it is likely better for you to stay together if your goal is for the sake of your children. We also need to think then about socioeconomic status. So in divorced families, one of the things that happens is oftentimes the child, the adolescent, experiences a serious drop in their family income level. So more and more we are seeing either joint custody or mom typically gets majority custody of the children. And we know that women typically earn less money than men do. And so oftentimes children see, if mom is their primary caregiver, they see a serious drop in their family's income. And so that can mean all kinds of different things. So maybe I no longer go to the same school that I went to before because I can't afford to live in that school district anymore. Maybe it means I can no longer take part in the extracurricular activities that I did before because we don't have the money to do it. So the socioeconomic side of divorce here seems to impact women more than it impacts men. And because women are more likely to have custody of the children, it then typically trickles down to the developing child. All right, let's talk about step families. All right, so for step families, this is becoming increasingly common, right, in the United States. So we see that parents are not only divorcing more than they were in the past, but they're also getting remarried more. So these blended families through step families are growing steadily. Okay, so parents are quite likely to get remarried after they get divorced. So if we think about how does this impact the developing child, there are some adjustment factors. Research shows us it takes about 2 years for children to become adjusted to the new family structure when there is a step family or blended family taking place here. And one of the biggest issues is what we call this boundary ambiguity. So if something is ambiguous, it's unclear, right? We don't exactly know what it is. It's kind of nebulous. So with boundary ambiguity, the child is unsure who in the new family, so who in the new family, the new step family, who's in the family, who's out of the family, who is responsible for what in the family. So think about, in the families that you have, there might be maybe one person who is primarily responsible for discipline, right? So maybe mom takes care of that and dad takes care of packing your lunches or something like that. Well, when we're in a step family, those roles all need to be renegotiated, and that takes about 2 years for the child to then be able to kind of understand with some degree of clarity, some degree of consistency, who will take on these new specific roles. All right, let's talk about working parents. Okay, so we've got lots of parents who work outside of the home. In particular, we have many mothers who work outside of the home. So many US women who are working outside of the home have a child under the age of 5, so young children. We are very concerned, right, with the effects of mom working on early childhood development. However, we do find with relative consistency that as long as mom and the child have a secure attachment, so as long as there is that deep emotional connection, that sensitive and responsive caregiving, that bond between parent and child, that having the child in non-maternal child care, so that would be in like a daycare or a preschool setting or something like that, having the child in that child care outside of the home does not seem to have a negative effect on the child's development. So having that secure attachment between mom and child seems to protect, right? Protect the child against some of the negative effects that could result if that secure attachment were not there. There are some positive effects though also. So on the whole, girls in particular seem to really benefit from having mom work outside of the home because it exposes them to less gender stereotyping, okay? So thinking about those very traditional gender roles. So dad is the breadwinner and mom stays home and takes care of the house. Well, if I'm working outside of the home, then there's oftentimes a more egalitarian, so meaning equal relationship in terms of household chores, household responsibilities between mom and dad. So girls then who observe this, who see this growing up, tend to have more equal views of males and females, right, and what their gender roles could be. All right, so adoption, this is becoming increasingly common, right? So increasingly common, increased diversity of both adopted children and adopted parents. On the whole, we typically find that most adopted children and adolescents adjust well. There is a period of adjustment, of course, just like there was with the step families, but nonetheless, most adopted children fare quite well in their adopted families. Probably not overly surprising here, but children who are adopted do better compared to children and adolescents who are either long-term in foster care. So with foster care, that's a temporary kind of placement. So they might be moved from home to home to home, which would be very difficult for a child, or if they are in some kind of institution. So institution, this would be like some kind of like home, orphanage or something like that, where children who do not have families go to live. So in the institution then, that's also oftentimes viewed as transient, right, or temporary housing, and your caregiver changes constantly because it's paid staff, right? So it makes sense then that children who are adopted into a family, they have more consistency, more regularity, and so they typically have better outcomes compared to children who are in foster care for long periods of time or institutionalized. This one probably also not that surprising either, but children who are adopted early, so adopted earlier in life, tend to fare better compared to children who are adopted later in life. All right, so let's talk about other types of families. So let's talk about gay and lesbian parents. So gay and lesbian couples are increasingly choosing parenthood, so choosing to have children. Okay, so you can see here, comparing the data from 1990, gay couples, so 2 men, with lesbian couples, 2 women who had children, comparing that to the year 2000, that's a pretty big jump, right? Yep, so a big jump here. And so for gay and lesbian couples then to have children, we are using typically some kind of reproductive technologies. So donor insemination, so this is for lesbian couples. So one person in the couple will get pregnant through some kind of donor insemination, or potentially adoption. So adopting from another couple, right? Some couples will also choose to have a surrogate. So someone else who essentially carries the child, right, or has the pregnancy for you, and then you adopt that child from them. Generally speaking, we find that there are very few differences between children and adolescents who grow up with gay fathers, lesbian mothers, compared to children and adolescents who grow up in heterosexual families. So there's really no difference between the two. All right, so let's talk then about social policy. So things that we can use to improve the lives of adolescents. So when we look at how can we potentially support things like social programs or other policies that would directly benefit adolescent development, we can look at things that you can do, right? Or things that you can encourage within families to support that optimal development. So things like showing warmth and respect for adolescents, showing them that you are actually interested in their life. So even though they might not want to talk to you about it, you need to still ask, right? That parental monitoring, that's another good example of I'm interested in your whereabouts. I'm interested in what you're doing because I care about you. Granting some degree of autonomy. You recognize that they are becoming adults, right? And that they need to be able to test out these newfound capacities, these new capabilities, being able to test out their new cognitive skills, so that abstract thinking, that idealistic thinking, and also their new socio-emotional skills too. We need to also then work to have those high levels of standards for adolescents. So communicating those to them, this is what I expect in terms of your behavior, this is what I expect in terms of achievement. So communicating those standards directly to adolescents. And then this one should sound familiar because we talked about, authoritative parenting in class on Thursday. So authoritative, remember, is a high level of warmth and a high level of control. So modeling those kinds of ways that we solve conflict, modeling those kinds of ways that we solve problems, working with adolescents using those inductive discipline techniques, that all of those can support optimal adolescent development. Okay, so I will see you in class on Thursday. Have a great rest of your day. See you later.